Chris, aka Zomproof, here with a new series, Evolution of an Idea. In this series, I'll be looking at changes of a game concept over time. In this first episode, I'll be looking at a genre that is near and dear to my heart, Star Wars flight simulators. As a young gamer living in a Macintosh home, there were fewer games for me to play than what most of my friends had. While this did expose me to Bungie early on through the Marathon series, my favorite game in the 90s was Xwing, the first Star Wars game to be developed by LucasArts. Some of my earliest memories are of watching the Star Wars trilogy at my grandparents' house on Christmas Day. I didn't care about the gifts, I only cared about the Rebel Alliance versus the Empire. It started a lifelong obsession that continues with me to this day. The late 80s, early 90s are known as the dark times for Star Wars fans. It was a time when no new stories were being told. Instead, the handful of media coming out was directly based on the films themselves, be it video games or tabletop RPG or action figures. Now, at the time, it wasn't really that unusual. Lucas had been making money on toys and other merchandise, while his video game division was focused on adventure titles, following the likes of Indiana Jones and Guybrush Threepwood. It may seem weird that they hadn't been working on a Star Wars game at their own, but they didn't own the license. That is until 1993, and for their first game, LucasArts took inspiration from another genre they had quite a bit of experience with: flight sims. You see, along with adventure games, LucasArts also developed Battlehawks 1942, as well as its two sequels and its spiritual successor, Secret Weapons Over Normandy, released in 2004. It may seem odd for LucasArts to make games based off World War II, but it's important to remember that the Death Star trench run itself was based off films like The Dam Busters, which follows British Lancaster bombers attacking the German Ruhr dams, and 633 Squadron, which follows the RAF, this time attacking Nazi heavy water plants. With that in mind, it's no surprise LucasArts took that pedigree to put players into the cockpit of the most famous starfighter in cinema history, the Xwing. Lawrence Holland was tapped to lead the team based on his experience with the earlier World War II simulators, originally following the events leading up to the Battle of Yavin, including recreations of the Death Star attack. The game allowed you to pilot the eponymous X-Wing along with Y-Wings and A-Wings. Two expansions would add the B-Wing and bring the story up to the establishment of Hoth Base. You received your missions from General Doadana and Admiral Akbar, the latter voiced by the actor from the films in the collector edition released a year later. The player character, eventually named Kian Farlander, was even added to canon at the time as the pilot of the surviving Y-Wing from the Battle of Yavin, though was later retconned after the Disney purchase, but he still remains a B-Wing pilot during the Battle of Endor, though I've struggled to find a good image of him. Fancy flying wasn't the only skill players had to master in the game. They also had to manage power levels between engines, shields, and lasers. This was the first time I had to learn resource management, as the wrong choice at the wrong time could see me blasted into bits. Other mechanics were the ability to focus your shields fore or aft, being able to lock your S-foils in case you didn't want to shoot at someone for some reason, as well as specific system damage that sometimes saw you waiting for your astromech droid to finish repairs before you could deliver the killing blow to a Star Destroyer. It's weird to look back and see how much multitasking I was doing at the time. Xwing was one of the earliest games to use 3D polygons as opposed to bitmaps, giving battles a better sense of scale and definition. The game also took advantage of LucasArts' patented iMuse, or interactive music system. This system dynamically changed the music based on what was happening in the game itself. While it sounds kind of basic, it was revolutionary for its time and originally designed for use in adventure games. But for the players, music cues from the movies that matched gameplay moments created a uniquely cinematic experience. And as a side note, Battlehawks 1942 actually also inspired another developer that continues to influence the industry to this day. Chris Roberts used it as inspiration to make his Wing Commander series, which ended up starring Mark Hamill in the third entry as the lead Christopher Blair 1 year after Xwing's release. Of course, at this point, he's better known for the Star Citizen. A year after the release of X-Wing, players were introduced to the other side of the Galactic Civil War with Star Wars TIE Fighter. Picking up after the Battle of Hoth, TIE Fighter follows a pilot under the service of Grand Admiral Thrawn in his first appearance outside of the trilogy written by Timothy Zahn. In the game, the Empire is portrayed more as a peacekeeping force, hence the focus on Thrawn as opposed to Darth Vader's more fear-based approach. This way, players flew missions not too dissimilar from those in X-Wings, just your ships could take significantly fewer hits. In 1997, X-Wing vs. TIE Fighter was released with a major multiplayer focus featuring 4v4 combat, disappointing fans in a series known for its single-player campaigns, which honestly sounds a little bit familiar, but you know what, we'll set that aside for right now. Developing a multiplayer game around space combat was an incredibly complex undertaking, especially for the time. For example, your targeting computer. In earlier games, when you targeted different ships, the system based their location of your ship as point zero on the X, Y, and Z axis, which you really can't do in a multiplayer game as it can't treat every ship as its own X, Y, and Z. So they had to redesign the engine to be able to handle the mechanics that players were already used to. There wasn't a hiding them behind any wall or corridor to be able to ease the workload. But nevertheless, in an effort to please fans, an expansion was released, The Balance of Power, with a story focused on missions for each faction, including taking down a super star destroyer, which sounds incredibly terrifying. The last game in the series came in the form of X-Wing Alliance, released in 1999. Starting as a member of a family-run transport business, you quickly get involved in the Galactic Civil War, joining the rebellion, with missions leading up to and including the Battle of Endor, and flying the Millennium Falcon into the second Death Star. It was really the perfect way to end the trilogy that began with the lead into the Battle of Yavin. With some new improvements to the games, which were more detailed graphics, in-flight dialogue that continued the story within the missions themselves, as well as missions that spanned multiple star systems, so hitting the hyperdrive no longer meant you accidentally quit the mission early. The game also contains links to other Star Wars properties like Shadows of the Empire and even the Thrawn trilogy. During this era, Star Wars Expanded Universe was, well, expanding. Quite rapidly, in fact. That's probably what led to the series kind of being left behind. It wasn't for the lack of stories or being interested in telling them. Most devs actively expressed an interest in continuing the series in some way, shape, or form. But The Phantom Menace and LucasArts had a whole new era to explore.
You ready for takeoff, Dallows?
Affirmative, Bravo 7.
With the prequel trilogy just getting started, LucasArts needed to capitalize in every way they could. And sometimes that meant sacrifices were made. Consoles were becoming more powerful and controllers were more capable at duplicating the abilities of flight sticks, though still not that close. So LucasArts started having developers work on games for a multi-platform release. One of the most famous being Star Wars Rogue Squadron, based on the pilots Luke Skywalker led post the Battle of Yavin. Released on PC and Nintendo 64 in 1998, 5 months before the release of Episode 1, the game took you out of the cockpit and put you behind the starfighters. This made it easier for flying around maps that took you back down to, well, air. In an effort to better map to a controller, features like power management were dropped, and the game took on a more arcade style of gameplay. It worked great on the Nintendo 64, but not as much on the PC. But nevertheless, the game was a hit and created the basis of Star Wars dogfighting for about the next 20 years. Rogue Squadron spawned 2 sequels on the GameCube and a spin-off on the N64, The Battle for Naboo. The third sequel in the Battle of Naboo changed the formula a little bit, allowing the player to control ground vehicles and even go on foot, but to inevitably diminishing returns. Starfighter, Jedi Starfighter, Battlefront, and Battlefront 2 from either Pandemic Studios or DICE. From 2000 to 2020, if Star Wars fans wanted a new game to pilot their favorite Star Wars ships, it wouldn't be in the cockpit, but from behind the starship. There may be a slight difference in the mechanics and game modes. Nevertheless, it was about making the game easier to pick up and play for everybody. And I want to stress that it's not inherently a bad thing, unless your game is focused on microtransactions and loot boxes. There should be versions of the game that are playable for everybody. It just felt like the flight sim community was getting left behind and ignored. One major advancement to come out of this era was part of an expansion to Star Wars Battlefront, the DICE version. While many, including myself, took issue with the game's focus on loot boxes and lack of any single-player story campaign, it was the first Star Wars game to include virtual reality for pilots. It was part of the tie-in for Rogue One developed by Criterion Games and was available as a free download for PSVR users on the PlayStation 4. A single-player mission that began with you being able to move around the Xwing using your regular dual-stock controller and being able to toggle individual buttons before you were launched into a mission that takes place just prior to the film events. I honestly wish there was a recording of the first time I got to play this. Even though I was holding a controller instead of a flight stick, being able to look around the cockpit and track enemies with my eyes was an amazing experience, and the closest I felt to actually being able to sit in an X-Wing cockpit. Though, honestly, if anyone at Disney or Lucasfilm wants to hook me up with a chance, just give me a call. There are some hope that VR would be further explored in Battlefront 2 when it was released a couple years later, but nothing ever materialized. Instead, fans had to wait until 2020. During the development of Battlefront 2, one of the other developers, Motive Studios, began work on what would become known as Star Wars Squadrons. Using lessons learned from Battlefront's development, the result was a game that returned very much to the roots of the original X-Wing series. The story alternates between Rebels and Imperials, each originally released with 4 ships covering different classes. Power management returns along with the ability to focus shields either fore and aft, and all versions of the game support HOTAS, or hands-on throttle and stick flight controls. New features include being able to direct your allies to specific targets, as well as VR for the PC as well as the PlayStation 4. And I have to say, playing this game in VR is a next level experience. You may not be able to flick the individual buttons anymore, but with a HOTAS stick, you feel like you almost can. Being in the middle of a dogfight in multiplayer just felt incredibly powerful, and it really puts you into the Star Wars universe. The story isn't really the strongest, but it does feature some fun cameos and fits neatly inside the Star Wars canon. The maps are filled with other ships, stations, and chaos in some cases. Multiplayer has really only 2 options, either dogfighting with 5v5 combat and fleet battles, which are kind of like a multi-stage tug-of-war that can be played either against AI or other players and culminates in taking down the other players' flagships. Playing multiplayer earns you experience towards leveling. Leveling earns you credits, and credits allows you to unlock customizations for your ships and pilots. There were no microtransactions, obviously a rare choice for a modern game, and it was really nice to go back to an older style of gameplay where you can just unlock these things as opposed to having to pay for them in some way, shape, or form. But I think that it actually speaks to the fact that EA really didn't expect this game to be that successful. While the game has a lot of strong polish, it clearly lacks in the content area. Again, there are only 2 multiplayer modes, and there were no plans for post-launch content, which isn't really the norm for a multiplayer game, especially a Star Wars property. In fact, very quickly after the game was released and patches were sent out to fix the major bugs, Motive was pivoted directly over to the Dead Space remake, which frankly does look like it could be a lot of fun. But so they instead had to focus on a handful of small updates that added some content, including adding the B-Wing for hardcore fans such as myself, and the TIE Defender, which gave you a TIE fighter with some good shields on it, as well as some more customization options like based on newer properties like the little baby Grogu you can have in your cockpit. No new game has been announced in the series, nor has any other Star Wars flight sim been hinted at, and I can only hope that changes. EA no longer holds exclusive rights to the Star Wars license, so I'm guessing they're focusing on the most profitable options. So where does that leave us, the fans? Well, every game I've discussed is playable in some way, shape, or form. Recent games are still available on the release platforms, and some are available through backwards compatibility. The older titles are available on GOG.com, including the original Xwing series, which I highly recommend if you have a flight stick. As for the future, who knows? We can only hope that Lucasfilm Games either pushes EA to make a sequel or another developer is allowed to take a shot at it. Remakes are all the rage, and maybe someone will redo the series with more modern flair. There is the opportunity that maybe some of the old developers are willing to come back to it and give a hand. But if you can, I would say watch this video, share this video, play the games, talk about them on social media. Make sure Lucasfilm Games knows what Star Wars fans actually want. That's going to be the best way to try to get any attention if you want to see another entry in the Star Wars flight sims. But either way, I want to thank you very much for watching. And please let me know, what are your favorite Star Wars games? It's a whole big universe of titles out there, and I'd be intrigued to see what other people enjoy. So just let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to hit the like and subscribe buttons. As always, I'm Chris, aka Zomproof, and may the Force be with you.